Awesome. Thanks, Debs. And yeah, great to be, yeah, all from load shed Johannesburg. Absolutely. So yeah, a real privilege and a pleasure to be able to present you today. Typically what I do at the time is I welcome our guest from IT Web, those parties that got together on IT Web and presented some content and some thinking and some thought pieces to the audience who met in Sandton. And this week, it's my pleasure to introduce myself. What I'd love to do with us is just use the next maybe 40 minutes to walk through as guiding principles, building a data-driven organization. But I wanted to highlight and almost substantiate for you why I believe that this could be one of the bigger governance initiatives globally that is taking place, and that we have had the privilege of witnessing and participating in. But I wanted to highlight to the audience today in terms of what does governance look like, data governance in particular, when one has to meet the needs at a country level. So we've often thought about governance with respect to within my department, within my business, and potentially even within the group. Seldom have we ever had to get our heads around what it looks like at a country level. And I guess some of you are even going, well, I mean, I know how hard it is within my division, within my department. Well, how is it even possible on a country level? And so that's what I would like us to hold today as a thought experiment through my discussion is, well, what would need to be true for initiatives, data initiatives in particularly within a country to be galvanized and governed against a particular, true north. Howard always says that, that one metric that matters, and what does that look like at a country scale? So I'm hoping that you're going to find this as exciting as where we've been collecting these lessons that I share with you this afternoon. So I've titled the talk "Building a Data-Driven Organization and Fundamentally Driven by Value and Guided by Governance." And anybody who had the opportunity to be with us most of last year, you would have seen that we went through some detail as we were establishing this process for some of our some clients in Saudi. And the way I thought I'd start today is if data is a great storyteller, I want to tell you the story. And in particular, the story goes like this. Debs, I can't see, sorry, just as an aside, Debs, I can't see the chat. So would you manage the chat whilst I tell the story?
JG, I'm here as well. I'll just keep a hand on there until she's back. Yeah, cool.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Paul. So, cool. So Paul, really great to have on the call, and it was great to go through some of these learning experiences with you, Paul. So once upon a time, there was a crown prince who lived far away in a desert. Remember, data's a good storyteller, so let it tell the story. This crown prince initiated a disruptive sporting event on a global scale and literally caused a division in the PGA championship within a roundabout maybe 6 to 9 months. So it's not so much about the golf, it's the scale and the fact that there was a disruption at a global level on a very established sporting front that took on the PGA. So that's one thing the Crown Prince did. The next thing the Crown Prince did was initiated a building project called The Line, and it originates in a town called Neom, and the plan extends for 170 kilometers in one direction. This thing is planned to be 200 meters wide, 500 meters high, and spanning 170 kilometers. And the rationale is, this is urban development of the future, because it takes into account transportation. It takes into account the movement of people. It takes into account living conditions. It takes into account the environment in terms of the total footprint being 200 wide, 170 long, is 34 square meters, 34 square kilometers, which is very similar to the square meterage of London. But yet it's promoting the fact that this is a coexisting environment between people, and so it goes on. Now, as an engineer, I'm scratching my head as to why you would ever design something long. I would always imagine a hexagon would be better, but be that as it may, here comes an initiative on a global scale, a mega project beyond grasp sometimes. And that's happened at the same time of this disruption of golf. But again, there's a crown prince who didn't stop there. The next thing that is happening is in a town called Jeddah, which is a town on the coast in Saudi Arabia. There is another mega project called the Jeddah Towers. And this tower is, Paul?
So sorry to disrupt your story. I don't know if it's just me, but my sharing just dropped.
Okay, thank you, Paul. I'll share again. Thanks, Paul. Is that okay?
There we go. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much. So another mega project, and this time it's a building, and it is planned to be 1 kilometer high, just over 1,000 meters. Another mega project. In one country, we're dealing with two mega projects that would simply it just does boggle the mind. This project is currently on pause for a whole lot of reasons, but nonetheless, we've got this building that's going up by 1 kilometer into the sky, and we've got another building that's going along by 170 kilometers, all of which mega projects. And we now have, you might remember the World Cup. We had the challenge of working in Saudi during the World Cup. And when Saudi Arabia won that game, and the Crown Prince promised all the soccer players a Rolls Royce, there was a level of national pride that is actually sometimes very difficult to comprehend. And it was incredible to see and to witness. But why then, in the auspices of these particular amazing feats, would there be a challenge for the Crown Prince to be losing sleep at night? So this Crown Prince, who's so far away, who's disrupted golf, building a big building, building a tall building, got a soccer team, is not sleeping at night. So the question is, why, with all of these incredible initiatives, is this person not sleeping at night? And fundamentally, the problem to solve is, how do we help Mohammed bin Salman Al Saud sleep at night? And the way you help him sleep at night is you've got to consider what's the question that's keeping him up at night. And this is where this construct of global or of a country-based governance program comes in. So the question is, how do you pivot your economy to decrease its reliance on oil-based product to ensure that your subjects have a flourishing future? How do you actually do that? And so because data tells a story, let's see what story the data is telling. So if we have a look at the Saudi Arabia GDP growth per non-oil sector, we can see that over the last 8 years, you could argue that that line is decreasing, but depending on which scale you're looking at, it looks quite flat. So Saudi Arabia is the biggest oil producer, and 46% of its GDP comes from oil. And has been like that for a long time. So there's a high level of forecast accuracy in terms of what oil is available. But what's really interesting is a development that is happening right now, and I'm sure a lot of us are aware of it, and that's got to do with some sustainability drivers where there are targets and goals that have been set for 2030 that require us to pivot away from fossil fuel drivers towards renewable fuel. And so the thing that is the unknown, the thing that is keeping the prince up at night, is the demand for the product that Saudi Arabia has typically offered to the world. And so if you are looking to pivot your economy away from oil towards non-oil based products and initiatives, and you look at this graph, it's like, oh, shucks, what do we need to do? How do we do that? We know what we've got, but we don't know the demand. The speed at which the demand for oil will decrease is what the unknown is right now. And the reason why that's unknown is I'd like to give you an idea in terms of this graph, which is, I think, summarizes some of the very important initiatives that are currently being taken place and in my experience being spoken about in boardrooms around the world and in South Africa as well, is how does one go about ensuring that the net emission path is reduced such that we are able to arrest the global warming increase of temperature to make sure that it doesn't increase by more than 2 degrees between 2030 and 2050. And so what this graph shows us is that if we continue as business as usual, that's the trajectory. There needs to be stringent emission reduction efforts, as in stringent, as in they are going to affect everybody. They're going to affect business, profitability, and so on. But it has to take place such that this line can invert. And then there is initiatives where you almost need to create, it's called, carbon crediting or carbon harvesting or carbon emission reversal, negative emissions, where whatever carbon you do produce, you have to fund mechanisms whereby the carbon that you are producing is netted off, hence that construct of netting, net zero. And failure to do that will have that temperature effect. And that is, in essence, what is trying to be arrested right now. Okay? So the prince knows that this graph is going to affect this graph, but it doesn't know the pace and the scale. So that's the challenge. That's why the prince is up at night. And what I'm going to walk you through now is what has been the thinking and the initiatives within Saudi that has driven the data to be an integral part of the product profile in the narrative about the future of the country. And so I'm not going to discuss this in detail, but just know that there are ways and mechanisms where globally measurements are taking place to understand what the effect is of your company on its supply chain, both up and downstream. And you as shareholders will be judged on, or management and shareholders will be judged on their impact that their business is having on the economy. And what's really exciting is from a South African perspective is our companies being strongly mining based, we're actually we're quite informed and mature at this, and we're leading the charge for a lot of the countries. So there is measurement in place, and it's global measurement, and therefore there's nowhere to hide. You actually just have to figure out how you handle the sustainability narrative. So is everybody comfortable? We've got a king not sleeping at night. We now know why they're not sleeping at night. And then let's have a look at what they do about that. So the important thing is in the middle, 2030. What fancy magic stuff is happening at 2030? And if you speak to Paul or myself or anybody that's been in the country in Saudi, you will see that there's an initiative called it's the 2030 initiative. It literally has that name. And fundamentally, what it looks to do is it says currently, I've told you there's 46% of oil. 46% of the GDP depends on oil. By 2030, that has to pivot. It has to swap around. It has to swap towards other initiatives that are not dependent on oil. And those initiatives are considering the position that Saudi occupies in where it is on the globe, is it lends itself to being an incredibly productive logistics hub. And COVID taught us an interesting thing is when you look at the risk mitigation that COVID, well, if you have a look at the effect on businesses as a result of COVID, one of the risk mitigation requirements going forward is to shorten your supply chain, not extend it. Those companies with very extended supply chains suffered incredible threats and sometimes demise as a result of their length of their supply chains. And so Saudi Arabia positions themselves to say, we potentially are the manufacturing hub of the world. And there are a whole lot of initiatives as to how does one do that. And that's one of the key projects that we worked on. And I'll tell you about that in a moment. But what I really don't want us to lose sight of before we drop into a project is the overarching governance that is being employed at a country level to pivot and shift. And one of my closing statements is going to be asking each one of us as passionate South Africans in the data industry, what learnings do the Saudis offer us that we can apply to ourselves? But let's carry on learning from the Saudis. Saudis have another interesting challenge. 58% of the population are below 30. 66% of the population are employed by the government. And 58% of the working population are expats. So I'm just going to say that again, right? Almost 60% are young, over 60% work for the government, and around about 60% of those working aren't from Saudi. So that immediately, these numbers just they tell a story on their own. The youngsters are desperately looking for something to do, and it can't be oil-based. There are lots of people that are currently in the government, so you can't just flick a switch. You've got to find a mechanism to govern the process of transition. And you've got 58% of people that aren't local, aren't Saudis working in your economy. You've got to find a way to make sure you remain globally relevant so that you can continue to attract that kind of workforce. So can you see why the king battles to sleep at night? And that's where we now enter into this process of like, well, what are they doing about it and how does it work? One of the initiatives is to grow the GDP growth in knowledge workspace. So data management and AI and analytics is classified within knowledge management. And so there we're saying 14% of the GDP is going to be required to be produced by 2030 from literally a zero base. It's a case of how do we make sure that we grow the youth, pivot away from oil, and remain attractive by a 14% GDP growth, and do that in the knowledge worker space, recognizing that we as Saudi Arabia offer two things: knowledge workers and location and space, as in space to put your factories. So how, Paul, I've just got to keep track of time. Paul, will you also be my timekeeper? You know I can run on these things. So
cool.
Two interesting goals have been set by the Saudi initiative with respect to knowledge workers. And those two goals are to be the top 10 in terms of open data provision, wanting to be top 10 in the world of providing open data sources. And you might remember Howard and I have discussed it in detail that an open data source says, let's not compete transactionally, but let's invite people to take the transactional detail, create a level of analytics and insights off the transactional data, and then let's compete and monetize the aggregate and the analytics, not the transactional detail. So that's the one initiative. And then the other is to be within the top 10 published AI academic paper publishers. So literally on the forefront, leading the charge with respect to AI initiatives at an academic level by 2030. So I just love the simplicity of what these numbers mean and how it drives the governance of what's necessary when a country is needing to pivot. And 2030 is not far away, right? So 7 years to go. The intensity is building up and it's mounting. And fortunately, there are, there are proof statements that are illustrating reasons to believe in the AI initiatives and the open data. And so it is not unrealistic to relook at the existing graph that I showed you. You might remember it looked like this. But this time, acknowledge that there's been a really interesting event. It happened to be during COVID, but it was also a purposeful initiation, almost a purposeful governance change that happened during COVID, where the trajectory of the GDP growth, of the growth of the non-oil sector was actually decreasing. So if you're trying to pivot and you've got a downward trajectory, it means that you're not doing very well. You're not pivoting. And if this could be recognized as a, I'm going to call it a governance event, a purposeful governance event, saying, what does this look like? And when are we pivoting? Are we allowed to extrapolate up this line? Now, I think for the data purists, you shouldn't really. I don't think this is allowed. I mean, this is really. But what that does is it potentially tells a story of the significant change that has happened kind of since 2017 or 2019, 2020, 2021. And now so the question is there a uptick? Is there a new dawn? Because if it is, it must come quickly because of the 2030 drivers. And then how does, race against time to ensure that our subjects have, the subjects have a prosperous future. And so the story that I told at the beginning, I want to put this in context as to what could be happening. Is it might seem completely bizarre to disrupt the world of golf. Why would you do that? Do you love golf that much that you thought you would just disrupt the status quo? I mean, why would you build a building that's just never been like that before, 170 kilometers of real estate to live in? Why would you build something that's a kilometer up? Why would you spend so much money on your soccer team? I think being here is the manifestation of the practical steps that one needs to do when you are doing a step change in the way in which you need to govern or motivate or drive or entice, or looking for other adjectives, a change in the mindset so that you can become economically viable in the future. And so I propose to you that the story that I started with, all happening like it's happening now, these things are being used to help a country set its sights, illustrate the possibility of a new future. And what is really exciting is the way in which data is being highlighted as one of the key catalysts in that change and movement across. And so I don't normally do a dramatic data point fitting as I've done, and I wouldn't encourage it, but for the narrative and for the story, I'd like to offer that as a perspective that maybe, just maybe, these massive events, these global kind of impacts that we're seeing the Saudi government offer to its people is because of this inflection point that needs to be taken care of. And so I spoke to you about the fact that one of the key differentiators is where the country is positioned in on the globe, and it's flat and it's hot. And agriculture is probably not the first choice of pivoting businesses because of water. The lack of water, there's lots of sun, a little bit of water, there's lots of space, and it's the ground is quite stable. It's solid rock. And so the case study that we're going to consider is a company called Mudon. And Mudon is an authority responsible for the regulation and promotion of industrial estates and technology zones in Saudi. So you can think of Mudon as a landlord at an industrial scale. So if you think of your biggest shopping center, imagine you walk into your biggest shopping center and you've got a whole lot of retail outlets in your shopping center. Imagine that we're not dealing with retail outlets, we're actually dealing with massive industrial investment. But at I'm going to use Santon City as an example. Imagine 200 odd retailers in Santon City. Well, imagine what 200 odd industrial implementations in an industrial city look like. And that's the scale at which we start to see these initiatives take place. And I think it's really encouraging that there are these initiatives that are just on such a massive scale. But what's quite what's quite humbling is to see why they're there. And that's that kind of pivoting from oil and how purposeful one needs to be. And so we started some work in the middle of last year. During a course of a 6-month period, we were looking at the data, counting the number of industrial cities. When we arrived, there were 32. When we left, there were 36. So in the space of 6 months, 4 industrial cities just came onto the target. And this picture gives us an idea in terms of how big these things are. So those of us who know, who might have come into contact with Howard, is we now had another problem to solve, which is, how do you deliver adequate data governance in a way that the business values? And how can you do this fast in a repeatable and scalable way? And so this resulted in potentially coming up with some thinking that might not be completely, just might not have had to happen in the past. Because how do you do this? When you arrive and you've got to deliver a project in 6 months, which typically takes 18 months, well, how do you do that? And the key, we thought, and what we proposed to the client and what was accepted and what we ended up delivering on, is how does one go about using your data management office, not just as a compliance vehicle, but as a competitive advantage. And that's where we need to introduce this 2x2 matrix. And so if you're going to be driven by value but guided by governance, the two axes that we need to look at is, you've got business value drivers on the y-axis, and you've got data management drivers on the x-axis. Now, how do you get a blend? What is enough? Because if you just go shooting up the y-axis, what happens is you're promising great value, you're leading with value. Oh, it's going to be value, we're going to do this. But the challenge is, because it's not bootstrapped with any level of governance, the DMO can't scale, the DMO being the data management office. So zooming up the y-axis is tricky. It's very attractive to the business because you're talking about how the data can be valued. And for example, one of the use cases was making sure that your tenant mix within an industrial city is optimal for the amenities that you offer your tenants. So, for example, one of the opportunities here is just to sell to any client who needs land. And the challenge is, you can sell to a bakery who needs power. Wonderful. But if you're selling real estate to a baker, but that piece of land has got 2 alternate, completely disconnected power supplies coming from 2 completely different sources, well, the smart box thing to do with that piece of land is to sell it to an Amazon or not a data warehouse. I've just lost the name. A data center. Because one of the key requirements for a data center is that you've got 2 electricity suppliers that are completely on separate grids. And so, here we're engaging with a client to say, no, I think you've signed up the wrong client for the wrong piece of land. And so, you've got one of us driving value and just wanting to sell, but yet, oh, come on, guys, it's not making sense. The other alternative is you lead with the compliance, and therefore your DMO is just seen as an audit enabler. And that actually was the environment in which we encountered our client. Our client was the DMO for Mudon, and the business wasn't quite sure what they were there, and they just saw them as a compliance offer or offering a compliance requirement. And so the question was, how does one blend? How does one get to the point where you make the DMO, you enable the DMO as a competitive advantage? And this is where we found a really piece of interesting, you can think of the DMBOK as the body of knowledge managing data governance. And it's a real privilege to have the DMBOK and to see that there are different versions and so on are being done. But what was interesting is that the NDMO, and I'll tell you about them in a moment, their data governance framework this does not look like the DMBOK. This looks like the DMBOK. This is the data governance framework with respect to the Kingdom of Saudi Africa. Now, there's quite a lot of overlap, but there's a really interesting fundamental difference, and that is there's this introduction of freedom of information, open data, and then data value realization. So freedom of information, open data, and data value realization are interesting constructs that if one looks at the DMBOK, they're kind of there, but they're not really specified specifically. For example, it's quite hard to, the real beauty about the DMBOK is it's a circular wheel. The argument is you can start anywhere, although that's great, but like, where do you start? Where should I start, etc. So I've got this challenge whereby there are two frameworks. The NDMO proposed this framework, and DAMA and the DMBOK provides this framework. And this is where Howard worked some incredible magic to go, what happens if we were to fetch or take some of the domains that are coming at us from this body of knowledge that's been prepared for Saudi and merge it and sequence it with some of the detail coming from the DMBOK as we know it? And we bring in the construct of a valuation and prioritization process, and we merge these things. And here is what we start to see as what we're calling the data value driven way, which is how does one go about starting and not losing sight of the value that the data can bring, and make sure that it then includes all of the governance domains that the DMBOK brings through and is really strong at. And so what you start to see is a emerging framework that brings in the construct of value coming from the Saudi framework, and the very strong data management processes coming from the DMBOK. You bring those together, and then you switch them on in a prioritized and sequenced agile way. We start getting towards what we call the data value driven way. And for the remaining portion of this talk, I'm going to be unpacking a little bit in terms of what that does, recognizing that Paul's keeping time on me, so 15 minutes. And the way in which this prioritized sequencing, or you can think of it as an agile data development lifecycle process, is taking the best from each of these frameworks, bringing them together, sequencing and prioritizing. Before I go to detail on the DVD way, what I would like to do is just not lose sight of how the Saudis got this framework together. Is they looked at this requirement is if you're going to want 14% of your GDP to be developed from your data as an asset and your knowledge work capability, you better give that some structure. And so what I'd like to just spend a moment on is our observation of the structure that we have come in contact with in the Saudi environment. And I'd really like us to think of this through the lens of a country. I mean, this to all intents and purposes is the key of my talk today. This is the country instituting a governance framework, asking every single constituent party within the country to operate against this standard, this framework, this methodology. And I'm not saying that we can get this right in one jump, but I'm saying that this is the kind of thinking that needs to be in place if you're looking to create or to govern a massive step jump in this case, the transition to non-oil, to renewable, non-oil-based products. 4 key components. I'm just going to touch on them quickly. I'm going to touch on SADEA last, and I was hoping that Howard would be on the call just to talk to this one, but I'll be able to tell you what I know, and if there's more detail, I'll be able to get it for you. But this bottom left is the National Data Management Office, NDMO. And fundamentally what it says is it requires every single either government institution or private company to have a data management office that is governed and managed according to a standard that they set. And one of our engagement with the client was to try and make sure that the client was in compliance with and aligned to the NDMO standards. So we were able to get a really interesting and front row seat as to what's required at a country level, standards set at a country level for government and for each of its constituents. Turns out to be a really hard task, but doesn't matter how hard it is, that's necessary if one is wanting to have these aspirational goals to get the kind of growth and development that you need to pivot by 14% on your GDP. Then you get an interesting entity, another authority called the National Information Center. Now, you can think of this National Information Center as a giant scrubbing machine, watching the data elements, knowing what it's expecting. When it finds that they are not in line with that, it starts to highlight to the dependent parties, why am I seeing data that I was expecting it to be cleaner, I was expecting it to be in a particular way, and I'm seeing it differently. It's not the most elegant way I've shared what they do, but can you just imagine their requirement in terms of trends, benchmarks, alignments, and a lot of the AI learning tools looking for outliers, looking for anomalies, and then raising those as items. You can think of as that it's a scrubbing machine looking for whether the standards are in place. And then you've got a National Center for AI. So this is an innovation and building capabilities in AI. So remember, if you're going to want to be top 10 in terms of your AI enabled industry initiatives, as well as paper generation and open data, well, then you better have a very strong master data, scrubbing, and AI sandbox capability where you go about making sure that you can start leveraging and optimizing this. Now, I recognize that we're dealing with a kingdom here. We're not dealing with a democracy. So there are a whole lot of data constructs that we stumble over every day that the kingdom would not stumble over because they have mechanisms in place where they do just collect data, but they've got very stringent ways in which they make sure that PAPIA and the necessary protection of that information takes place. For example, you won't find any government information sitting on any cloud anywhere. They have their own internal cloud infrastructure, but there's no global any of the big 3 vendors. There's no government information sitting on those big 3 vendor infrastructure. And then you bring all these things together in terms of the Saudi Data and AI Authority, and its job is to make sure that it delivers against that mandate of a 14%, increment. And so fantastic, the Saudis have got this initiative in place. It's been fascinating just to read up on how it's morphed and it changed over time. This is not something they just dreamt up in 2019 and launched in 2020. They've actually had multiple iterations, growing, evolving, coming together. And so what this did is gave us great confidence in the framework and the thinking in the framework, such that we should bring these together and bring and institute what we call the data value driven way. And so just using a couple of moments from here to kind of highlight that the why in the data driven way, you know, the why of the way is that we are really encouraging all of our constituents to make sure that you create the mechanisms and the structures that make decisions, or to help make decisions that matter promptly and well. So I don't think there's any doubt in terms of the goal that you know make decisions that promptly and well. But what I really find fascinating is how you go about this process of aligning the value. Because remember, you might remember this was, you know, to align with both the requirement of strategic alignment to your business drivers, to your industrial drivers, and what I've highlighted, to your country drivers. So what's been really interesting on the work that's taken place is the extent and the intent, the extent and the commitment of alignment to a country goal, a national goal, an industry goal, a company goal, and then potentially your business unit within the company. So, you know, this construct of alignment is this use case, I'm hoping, just highlights the fact that, oh wow, isn't it amazing that it is possible to get a level of alignment way beyond where we're sometimes punching, which is, you know, just to get alignment within the business. We've covered define and find value in detail, and then the driving value and the baking value. And here I encourage anybody who, if these don't, you know, if these terms don't resonate with you, I feel like we covered this in an extensive amount of detail last year, and maybe even the first month of this year. But this construct of aligning value is the point that I really wanted to highlight in terms of why I proposed to you at the beginning of today's talk that I feel like we actually are dealing with. We could see this as a giant governance and alignment use case, and just great to illustrate how countries done that at that kind of scale. So I think that there's an opportunity to go into detail, but I also feel like there's an opportunity to just pause and get some questions that might be on people's minds in terms of how, and in particular, if I can start asking you, like, what would need to be true in our context with all of the challenges that we have? What little nuggets can we potentially lift from learning from the Saudi use case that I've walked through, in terms of, you know, what does that look like? And I would love just to maybe initiate a bit of a debate or a discussion in terms of the fact that somebody else has been able to do it. Awesome. What can we learn from them? And even if it's as a DMBOK community, how do we go about making sure that, you know, we can leverage some of these? So Paul, I'm going to stop here for a moment. I'm going to stop my sharing, come back to just offering some question or some. Maybe I'm not sure whether there are any questions in the chat that.
Nothing at the moment, JG.
Oh, it was that clear, was it? So yeah, I'd like to, just considering that, you know, we've got 5 minutes left of Prezo and then into talking, I would love an opportunity to maybe just get a sense from the audience. Is there, you know, what was noticeable, and you know, was there anything here that you're going, oh, that will never work for us, you know, high level of disbelief? I'd love to just find out if there's anybody that wants to just chat through that.
All right, JG, thanks so much. That was a fascinating expose, albeit very abridged. I could only imagine the mammoth task underlying and underpinning all of that work. So kudos to yourself and Howard and everyone else that was engaged in that project. It is, yeah, pretty awe-inspiring. My takeaway from this in all of the 5 minutes is that it is very glaring and glaringly obvious in terms of what political will and resources thrown behind that political will can achieve.
Mm-hmm.
So that for me is immediately a nugget in terms of what we could achieve. We had that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, it's really nice for me to, paint a bit of a picture here. And look what's happening. And imagine, as you share that, is there are massive, there's massive resistance to some of these initiatives. So I've highlighted to you in terms of what the optimum path looks like. There are huge challenges. For example, think about what happens to the demographic. Is if you've got 50% of your population under the age of 30, and one of the initiatives that you're looking to drive is, I would say, data can be considered as a relatively new industrial weapon vector. And it stands to reason then that a lot of the youngsters will be drawn towards this as a particular avenue to explore for their careers. That's exactly what the country wants. But have a look at those people that are over, all of a sudden you start to create a disconnect between your young and your old. And that's been a fascinating observation too that we've had, is that we went into some environments, we're going, we're the old people. And when I say old, I'm calling myself old. Where are the people that are 40, 50? Because they're not there. This process is being run by youngsters. So I want to highlight the fact that the political will is not because it's easy. The political will is because there's this draconian consequence if we don't. And I would say that within the South African context, we have a similar draconian requirement, as we're actually looking to pivot away from natural resources in terms of offering employment. And so I would say we've got a similar challenge. You're quite right with respect to the political will. That has to be that, and I get it. The Saudi in the construct in Saudi, it's a kingdom. It comes with a decree. It doesn't come with a vote, and it would be nice, and let's try this. So that I get completely, and I think, Ranj, your point there is completely valid. It's like, oh wow, we might have some real challenges to get to that point, and kudos to the management team of Saudi going, look, if we have that opportunity, let's leverage it. It's a kingdom, it's a decree, here it comes. But quite right, Manj, but I want to highlight the fact that just because we might not have that political desire or even understanding as to the power of it, it doesn't mean that we as practitioners shouldn't look to offer that to each other, for example. But your point is well made. It's kind of, I guess, I deliberate. I mean, Paul, you managed. Paul was also really instrumental in deploying this. Paul, like when you look at what we saw in Saudi, and with my description, and what we see in South Africa, where are you discouraged and where are you encouraged?
Sure, JG, I think just when you talked about the resistance that we experienced, and I often pondered on why, getting involved in some other DMMA work, maturity assessment type work, you experience the same as resistance across the board, because it comes across as a threatening, am I doing my work correctly, or it's also exposing what I don't know. And so that's, I think that I was just thinking and trying to articulate it in my mind. I was saying, how do we expose the maturity to the South African context to show them the value of this? These are the possibilities, because it's that place of what I don't know. It doesn't make sense that I can actually derive value out of this thing. So it's It's for other people. It's for, and again, to Manj's point, I think also that strong leadership in taking the time to understand what value can be leveraged out of these initiatives. Yes, it comes across looking like a regulatory effort, but actually behind the scenes, it's a value effort. But you need these things in place, and it takes study, it takes knowledge, and that kind of uplift to be able to see that. And for guys like yourself and Howard that have been around the block a few times, also youngsters, but around the block a few times, I've noticed how quickly that the opportunity to unlock value was presented, was not obvious to you, but it came quickly. When you looked, when you guys were assessing the specifications and what the NDMO was asking for, the value just started to pour out of those things. It wasn't just a regulatory, you must do this effort. But that comes with knowledge, it comes with maturity, it comes with experience. And I think if you can, I think we have it in South Africa, it needs to be unlocked. It needs that. And that's what I think is awesome about the DAMA community and the CDMP path, the studying of the fundamentals, opening people's eyes to those capabilities is awesome.
Cool. No, thanks for the sharing, Paul. Does anybody else, was there any other observations that anybody wants to just share in terms of, as you trying to land this in your own head, can do, can't do, should do, inspiring, anything else? No problem, Vanj, thanks so much. Awesome. Cool. I think we
like a bunch have to run.
No, all good, all good.
Okay.
Ting, I think I've pronounced your name terribly. Help me with the pronunciation. Tuting.
Also not there.
Okay. Also not there. Cool. Okay, team, hundreds. Ross,
thank you for the nice bringing it nicely together in a different angle of looking at it. Very good.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I mean, Paul, I always think that we have to understand why we go and sit in the desert for such a long time. So I'm hoping that, so I'm glad that it was a different view for you, Paul. That's awesome.
Also, you asked the question, why did he do this? The big tower, the long tower. And one of the things that came to mind was, hey, notice us. We're coming at you. We are here. We're not an oil people, but we are here.
Often I think we forget that one of the key governance, if you think about how the board of a company is assessed with respect to its the way in which it governs a company, is one of the key questions that gets asked is, did you take every possible step to ensure the longevity and the productivity and the economic viability of the company that you were running?
Sure.
So, we quickly rabbit hole governance into, did we, a checkbox exercise. But at a board level, a board will live and die by the fact that did they or didn't they take the necessary precautions to be able to ensure the success and the success of their business. And that's been one of the key arguments for sustainability, is that as a business, if you are not taking your sustainability narrative seriously and figuring out the impact that you have from from an environmental, social, and governance perspective, you will be found short.
Sure.
Or you will be found begging with respect to your governance. So, I laugh about the story about the king, but as a monarch, you have responsibility to ensure the flourishing future of your subjects.
Sure.
And so that's why I argue that we are dealing with probably one of the biggest, we have the luxury of viewing one of the biggest governance pivots that's happening right now. It's fascinating to see the governance in action. And governance takes hard decisions, hard calls. You know, it requires infrastructure structures and so on. So, all very cool. I think if there's nothing else, Ross, Debbie, all good. Zing, we're good to go. Let's call it a day.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing.
Awesome.
Thank you, JG.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.